Great to be here talking to you for OliFest. I'm going to talk today about building and running world-class observability functions. A little bit about me. So, as I mentioned, my name's Rob Skillington, the co-founder and CTO of Chronosphere. I am the M3 open source creator, which is a open source project around a highly distributed, horizontally scalable metrics platform that was open source at Uber. I'm a open metrics contributor, and my Twitter handle is Roskally. And I've been working on observability for some time. I started off at Microsoft working on Office 365. And actually on some of the monitoring aspects of that in particular, and then have gone through several early stage startups, scale up teams that were acquired at Groupon, and then at Uber. I built the monitoring and observability metrics platform over 4.5 years. After some time on the dispatch team. And now Chronosphere, I get to work on my favorite thing that has been a theme through all of this, which is building systems at scale and helping others do that, which is extremely rewarding. So today we're going to talk about define what observability is. We have a definition that we like to think of in particular that we'd like to share, walk through the people and functions that will take part of observability, look at some of the KPIs and metrics that you'll want to know about when you have a team kind of performing this work, and what does success look like for them, and then walk through taming data growth and managing observability as it matures at an organization. So what is observability? Fundamentally, we don't think about it typically as the how, as is metrics, logs, and traces is obviously brought up often when you think about this. And I just wanted to share, of course, that observability to myself and everyone else here that I've worked with in this space for a while is really about the story of how you run and scale systems reliably. So what goes into observability? One, the way we like to think about it is essentially the one of the most important aspects, of course, and the one that comes first is the knowledge of a system, of a business, of an organization. So really, everything that goes into knowing how things are running. And of course, them providing you signals and the ability to explore what is happening and how it's happening is extremely important and helps you, of course, determine things like, is something in the system about to happen, or certain degradations occurring that could lead to a bad user customer experience. And obviously in the monitoring and observability worlds, those that part of the knowledge that we gain is very, very important. Then of course the second phase side of observability is typically triaging those insights. So how quickly can you act on this data, on this knowledge base that you have accessible, and then of course once you can act, and once you have acted, so say that could mean mitigating an issue, that could mean fixing a performance problem, both of which, mitigating an on-call issue you want to do immediately, and every second counts there. Improving the performance of a system, or fixing edge cases, that happens over days or weeks, obviously, and that takes longer. But that's all part of triage. And then, of course, understanding is, how do you find the underlying cause of something that's happening, or what are you going to do with the output of the knowledge that you have about the system, and the actions that you can take, and how you're going to feed that back into improving systems, and or fixing, finding the underlying root cause of problems in your system. So we like to think of knowledge, triaging, and of course leading to understanding, which can then feed back and restart the loop again. So what does an observability function do? Whether that's people or processes, or what does observability look like? We believe, and based on my time at Uber, where we a lot was asked of us from the engineering organization. We truly believe, first and foremost, when you're performing observability at a company or an organization, you need to define the monitoring standards and practices. This is really providing guides for developers and engineers at your organization on how to monitor your systems. So documentation, guides, and best practices. So really kind of that educational aspect, and defining how the nuts and bolts of how monitoring happens at your organization. And then, of course, the next thing that we think about is delivering, of course, monitoring that knowledge and monitoring data to your engineering teams. So this is obviously where we spend a lot of time as practitioners, but of course, it's just one of 4 very major responsibilities that we need to be giving back to the developers and engineers that depend on your observability function. And then, of course, the next most important thing after delivering is measuring the reliability and stability of your monitoring, maintaining trust that the systems will be available when needed, and making sure that you have very clear insight to what parts of the system and your product are highly observable, which parts aren't, and having a full picture and map of where observability today at your organization is, and the parts that need work, the parts that don't need work, what's kind of dark and what's and hard to understand, and what's more clear and in focus, because that will kind of help you guide like what parts of observability do you want to work on next, and what is working and what is not working. And then, of course, managing all these observability systems. So making it straightforward and simple, so that people use these systems, and providing a really robust, automated set of services that can be self-service to your end users. So let's look at one of the models of running practicing observability at an organization. Often one that most companies and organizations start with is embedding an SRE or a developer or a DevOps practitioner inside of each team, or at least inside of each of the largest teams at an organization. So, of course, the reason this is ideal is it's easy to get started, and usually perhaps the SRE kind of role hasn't really been siphoned off to a central organization yet at your company or organization, and this is kind of the decentralized model. The challenges with this is that teams often end up using different tools and processes. You don't have a global view across everything because each team is monitoring or monitoring things differently, and teams are reinventing the wheel. So there's duplicate efforts, and one thing looks like an apple, another thing looks like an orange, but they're really trying to service the same thing. They just ended up looking different because of the nature of how they were put together by independent distributed teams. And then, of course, there's the centralized observability model, which I'm a huge advocate of. This central observability team is usually a subset of the SRE organization or similar. They define monitoring standards and practices as one unit. They provide all the tools and make sure that when a team needs like a very common thing, that it's available to everyone else at the company in the same way, or at least has a building block that they can go and solve a use case in a very straightforward manner, because there's a cookbook or a recipe for doing what they're looking to do. And then, of course, the other major thing here is that you usually end up with a central view, or at least a way to navigate the distributed nature of the monitoring data, because a central team is managing that, and they usually have a much better idea of how the monitoring systems are working, and have higher levels of availability and robustness, usually just because there's one body kind of looking after it. So when you have a small team, and often, especially when you go to the dedicated observability model, you will end up with a small team, given that the SRE is usually is responsible for a lot of things at a company. So observability is obviously tackling just one part of the mission of keeping software reliable and running like clockwork. So you'll usually end up with small teams. What are some of the things that we think is important to keep in mind, given that these teams are small? So what your organization emits in terms of telemetry and monitoring data is critical. More data is not necessarily better. High quality data is the thing that is most important. Because high quality data, you as a human are trying to map out exactly how your organization operates in a human mental model. And then essentially, you're basically trying to make the systems that is collecting monitoring data and telemetry data to be able to show you that mental model in real time and let you alert and pivot on that mental model, so that you can navigate and operate systems at scale, and even whether that's small scale, large scale, whether that's scale of complexity versus scale of operations per second. Both are very, very real things that are a lot easier to do once that mental model has been established, and then also everything's been set up to capture that mental model into your observability and monitoring systems. And of course, again, it's not the volume, it's really how the quality of that capturing of that data, making it accessible so that other people can see that data in the view of the mental model that you have of your systems. So the other thing here you want to think about is that only according to GitLab survey in 2021, like just this month, actually, it was released, only 26% of developers instrument their code for production monitoring. Now that is up from 18% last year, which is a good sign, and probably also what's leading to a growth in the size of all this data, because more people are developing custom metrics, custom log statements that can be pivoted on, and emitting traces. But keep in mind that there's still 74% of developers that aren't touching any of this stuff, and they need to be able to still go and use this mental model and see and get a lot of insight into their systems without going and writing a whole bunch of custom instrumentation to monitor their systems. So here's really where you want to think about, like, let's get the basics first. So give them great RPC metrics, give them great HTTP traffic metrics, give them great container metrics, give them fantastic and consistent logging across everything, so that when you write logs in one way, that can be pivoted similarly. You can slice and dice by the region, you can slice and dice by parts of your business or organization. So if you operate in a market where you have very different patterns depending on users accessing your product from one part of the world versus the other, you'll want to silo serving those different markets differently, so you can slice and dice the data by that, whether that's looking at metrics, logs, or traces. So really working on giving like a crisp set of things out of the box, so that SREs and also your end users who are developers and engineers on your teams can go get a lot for free, and don't have to do much work to get and see that mental model represented well in your observability systems. And then, of course, don't build if you don't have to. Most user-friendly vendors or open source solutions out here will get you moving really quickly. And really what you should be thinking about here is, what's the minimal effort you can put in to deliver the most value. And obviously the most value is that mental model mapping, as I'm talking about. It's not about writing, a database to store your metrics. Unfortunately at Uber, that was something that we spent time doing, but that was after we had exhausted using things completely out of the box. And once, the engineering organization was in the thousands of engineers. So really what you wanted, but I will say the other part that I want to mention here is you do want maximal future proofing. So when you go and do work here, or you go purchase vendor products, you want to make sure they're cloud native friendly. They play with all the tools that you already have, and all the the ecosystems that you run internally. So they have great solutions for RPC monitoring. They have great solutions for looking at transactions that you basically constantly are monitoring. So think about what you pull off the shelf from a vendor or from the open source space. How is that going to live on? Where is that in that product or open source project in its life cycle? And if you do need to make a change later, is that a major change, or are you choosing one of the more tried and true things that have a standard around it, similar to open metrics is a standard now in CNCF and has an IETF standard coming soon around it. Which if you use Prometheus, and which is built on open metrics, you can be pretty sure that all vendors and open source projects will be Prometheus compatible in the near future. So that's kind of really what I was getting at. And so, when we think about so stepping back a little bit, so these are some of the things I just talked about some things that we could focus on as a small observability function. But how do we measure how that function is doing? I think, some of the interesting KPIs and metrics you want to think about is, how many people do you have on the team? How much should you be investing, and how do you measure success? So how many full-times you have on the team? At Uber, the story goes, when I joined, when we were just above 100 engineers, there were 2 folks that worked and on the SRE team, of which was about 10 or 20 people, had basically, set up Graphite and made sure that all the client libraries were well defined on how to instrument your application, showed you how to set up logging and see logging data either in a browser or using a command line utility. So, 2 folks were managing all of that and not really as a full-time gig, more, just that was the kind of projects they did and they supported that, but they also had other work that they did in the traffic routing space and stuff like that. So you can think of it like a 2% of your organization is a pretty good rule of thumb. You can see that when we went dedicated with 5 and 500, that was 1%, but that's 1% dedicated people. So either like 2% shared or 1% dedicated, I think is a good rule of thumb there. In terms of like how many like resources, so, like in terms of spend, this is going to vary widely. Some companies, spend a lot, and at Uber at our peak, when folks were using more and more and more and were growing quickly and needed everything at their fingertip to be able to make decisions quickly and rely on their systems being up and using observability to monitor and react to that quickly and roll back things. Even high cardinality data was very, very important. We were using pre custom built software here, and we're relying on Cassandra and Elasticsearch to which had scaled our Graphite out horizontally. So we were at 8% at one point, and obviously M3 open source M3 project was basically born out of bringing that same let users go crazy, give the organization like everything at once without limiting them really too much, but at a price point that's going to not cost the business 8% of its infrastructure costs. So we hyper optimize M3 down to about 3%. But you got to remember that we had very, very small limits on what we provided to the organization with our metrics and logging as well. We gave a lot of logging away for free. Although just making logging scale horizontally across multiple teams was actually quite difficult. We were using Elasticsearch at the time. But anyway, 3% I think is if you're giving users a lot to them is a reasonably healthy number. And if you want to be more restrictive and provide a little less at the cost of things, then you could go down, I guess, but your end users and developers are going to be restricted in what they can do, obviously. And then measuring success, you want to think about the SLOs, the SLIs that should be in place there for your own observability systems. Are you getting the rest of the organization to actually define their own SLOs? Do folks feel like they are advanced users? Those are all numbers you should be tracking. In terms of like the high level things though that really matter quarter to quarter, the NPS scores are what's going to drive that. You can set up all manners of reporting on like how folks are using the products, have they defined SLOs, have you defined SLOs, and are you meeting them for your own monitoring system? But really the NPS scores are going to determine whether folks feel like at your organization, obviously, how well are you doing in providing them observability. And then, of course, just looking at the ER outages and seeing and on a case-by-case situation, like, are end users responding quickly enough? Are there clear gaps? And are you closing those gaps in observability based on the incidents that you have at the company or the organization. So, I wanted to talk like a little bit about like this explosion of data. I think we're all kind of well aware about it, but obviously you can see like move from monoliths to microservices, virtual machines to containers. There's like a lot more ephemeral data going on. We're experimenting much more, so we're slicing and dicing our data by experiments. We're delivering things to different geographies. All this is really amplifying the amount of like the complexity of our systems, and therefore obviously to give a full insight into what's happening, we have much more observability data in general at our company. So I wanted to talk a little bit about taming that data growth. There's tensions between too much and not enough information in terms of like which drive a lot of like this data growth. You should create an internal guide and framework on what metrics and logs and traces, for instance, will use what tags by default, and give recommendation to how granular folks should get. And then, it's kind of too hard to deal with the cardinality of, high cardinality of, say, metrics or really high volumes of logging at a micro level. So, create dashboards to show everyone what's happening at Uber, because we were very permissive with what folks could do. Obviously, this was more of this reporting structure let us have like really healthy conversations with the end teams. And honestly, the top 10 or 20 folks were responsible for like almost 90% of the large volumes of monitoring and telemetry data. So that kind of reporting can provide you the structure in which to have those healthy conversations without having to get extremely brutal on anyone. And then, of course, having said that, the ownership needs to be on, and the onus needs to be on the team themselves, the end user teams themselves, because that's really where they've got to be good citizens, and there has to be incentives for them to be good citizens. So making sure that there's some shared responsibility there. So I wanted to take just a quick second to talk about what it means to up level once you have all of the things we just talked about. So really you want to focus on increased automation where possible, creating a consistent experience for everyone and a global view. So basically one of the greatest parts of our NPS scores that we found was anyone could just like go, pull in, start writing a microservice, and the frameworks and libraries that we had recommended all like worked out of the box. They didn't need to register anything. They didn't need to stand up any infrastructure. Their application would automatically get monitoring for free. And so, you want to drive to that level of consistency and ease of use to make it magical for your end users and developers. You want to create, obviously, have fantastic uptime and availability and reliability of your own metrics platform. So make sure to monitor, the monitor, and you want to control the data flow that's happening. You want to retain data at the granularity necessary for the business, not just the fire hose of what folks are sending you. Obviously, at Chronosphere, a large part of our product is and open source M3 and the aggregation tiers around really shaping that data on the way in to exactly what you would like it to look like, so that you have fast queries that don't store a whole lot of raw data that you don't need the granularity of. And so things like peeling away the instance ID on a default set of metrics can go a long way. And of course, you want a safe way to experiment and quickly iterate. So sandboxing and allowing folks to try out new super high cardinality metrics without interrupting other people is a great example there of something that can help teams quickly iterate on really powerful observability functions. So that's everything. The key takeaways, like how do you practice observability? Think through that. What does your knowledge of your system look like? How do you deliver that knowledge to end users and developers? How quickly can they triage? How effectively can they triage? And how can they understand the root cause of a problem and answer that answer deep questions. And then, of course, we talked through, centralized versus decentralized teams, taming data growth and cardinality, and up-leveling your observability function. So we went through a lot today. Thanks for joining me. It was a pleasure. Have a great day, and thank you to the organizers.